Hello and welcome to this second TechSec video tutorial, and in this video tutorial I'm going to cover the first of the modes that TechSec offers, and the mode I'm going to cover is the simplest mode, the SVG mode, or Scalable Vector Graphics mode. And in this mode we create a section plane, and where that section plane meets or crosses or intersects geometry within the Blender scene, then we create an SVG file, a scalable vector graphics file of that section, and with the option of creating a PNG file of that section as well. So this is a non-interactive mode, it's the simplest mode. It's non-interactive, so once we've positioned the plane relative to our geometry, then we hit a button and the SVG is created. And this mode is kind of, well, it was the first mode I wrote, and in some respects it was a proof of concept. But for the user, one might imagine that if you've got very, very large models and the interactive modes, the scaled and free interactive modes are too slow, then this simple SVG mode can be quite good at just generating initial sections and getting a feeling for the look of what a particular section plane location relative to your cuttable geometry looks like. So I'm going to start with a super simple scene, a little garden shed, and this garden shed is comprised of all sorts of different objects comprising up the different construction elements of the shed. And the objects within this shed, I've already given them the relevant TechSec options of the line weighting and the color and the pattern fills, etc. And I'm going to cover those options a little bit later in this video. To begin with, I just want to talk about the creation of a section plane. So if I just come to wireframe mode, now I'm just going to create a plane. And you'll see that I've sort of organized things here a little bit within my scene in different collections. I've got sort of different elements of my building in their own collections, and that's kind of handy for reasons that I'll talk about later. But I just want to find this plane that I've just created. And where is that plane that I've just created? It's there. So fortunately, when you do have lots of collections like this, and I've got lots of objects, partly for the vegetation in the background, etc., you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to move that to my sections collection. So that plane is in my sections collection. And this is where I'm, in this particular scene, I'm keeping all the different objects that I've used as section planes. Now I'm going to rename this my SVG section. And this plane needs to be now designated as a section object. And one other thing I will say is that if we come into this object, into edit mode, we see that this plane, this default plane that Blender creates, only has one face in it, and that is a requirement of both SVG and scaled modes, that the plane only has one face, and it should also be perfectly rectilinear, either a square or a rectangle. So my recommendation is that you just create a plane through this default Blender mechanism. You don't edit it, you don't change it yourself in terms of the geometry of the plane, but you rely on the TechSec options to create the size of the plane that you need for the size of section that you require, and that's what I'll detail now. So the first thing to do is, in the Object Properties panel, with that plane selected, we go to, in the TechSec section here, we select Section. Now as soon as we do that, we see that the plane changes size, and it changes size in accordance to the options we've got set up here. So just to run through this TechSec view panel settings, which you can get to with this TechSec tab here, and this sidebar is viewable by toggling the N key. This first option selects a mode. I'm talking about SVG mode here, so I'm going to keep that on SVG. Then we have page size. So at the moment I've only coded in ISO page standards, the A page standards. So we've got A0 up to A4 here. So A4, this becomes smaller. A3 becomes larger. A0 becomes largest. So I think maybe A3 will do for me. And we also have scale. Now what I might do, although you shouldn't edit the geometry of the section plane, you can absolutely rotate it as you see fit. That's fine. As long as the plane keeps the same form, then you can move it about to your heart's content. So that kind of encompasses my scene. I might come to solid mode for a moment. That kind of encompasses my little garden shed, so that looks fine. But I can also change the scale. So if this A3 section is going to be at 1:20, again that will change the size of this relative to the Blender's geometry. So 1:20, 1:50, 1:25 kind of works for me here. The next option is image DPI. So this is going to set the DPI of the PNG image, which is created from the SVG image. So this is important because it's not necessarily so important in SVG mode, although it can be, and I'll talk about that a bit in a moment. This is more important in scaled and free modes, where we're visualizing the section potentially within Blender's viewport here, and this image DPI can then become very important because at low settings it keeps the visualizations as interactive as possible, and at higher settings we get better image quality. So generally speaking, we keep this relatively low while we're changing things and manipulating things to get a good section, and then we would increase this at the end for a final sort of image output or visualization output. So I'm going to keep that on 96, the default for the moment. Now before I go into any of these options, I can now just press SVG section. Now not a lot happens in terms of what's going on in Blender, but what has happened is that if I come over to my file browser and I come into this folder here, now you'll see that this blend file is saved in my home directory store Blender 293 TechSec2.blend. So that means that in my store Blender 2.93 TechSec2 folder, I now get all the sections and SVG files that I'm producing from this operation. So in this folder is my Blender 2.93, here is TechSec2.blend, here is a TechSec2 folder. So it just has the same name as the blend file without the blend extension. So SVG section -0 minus section.svg. This is the file that we have just created. So it's the name of the section plane, which is SVG section, -0, which is the face number of the section object that this SVG has been generated for. And because this section plane only has one face in it, that number is 0, and then just minus section as a standard to fill out the name. So if I look at that, in, for example, Inkscape, then we can see there I have my SVG section, which is the intersect of this section plane with this geometry. So pretty simple. So if I was to move this plane to there, do it again, and if I now revert back to the on-disk copy, we see now we get a different section. So yes, non-interactive. You press a button, the SVG gets created, but it can be useful just to get the section in the right place, or possibly just for a final output. In addition to the SVG being created, I'm in my image editor window here at the moment. I'll just maximize this window again. I'm in the image editor window here, down here, and if I come to SVG section -0 section, we'll see that I do have, from the SVG file that was created, I do have a PNG version of that SVG file. And this will update automatically every time we change this section. So if I move it, I don't know, to that back corner, and we get a new version appear instantly to pop up. So this could be a sort of more convenient way of just checking the changes that are created by changing your section plane. Now you might wonder, how do we know which way is up relative to this section plane? And that way is through the local y-axis. Now I've got local axis turned on here. If I go to global axis, we'll see these movement arrows, and these movement arrows are turned on with this movement gizmo button over here. If we have a look at these movement arrows, then we can see that these arrows, and I can move my section plane with these arrows, they are aligned to the global grid, global Blender space. So the green Y arrow points in the positive Y direction, and the red X arrow points in the positive X direction, positive Z direction. If I turn on local, then those arrows now relate to the local axis of this section plane, and the top is always the green one. Now the importance of the local axis is if I was to rotate this plane, my y-axis, my y local axis direction still aligns with the top, or what you might consider to be the top of this section. So it means that you can rotate this section however you want, and the local y always points to this edge here, and this edge will represent the top of the page. So if I SVG section that, yeah, well, we start to get some rather strange sections for our building. But you can see that this is now rotated, because the plane is rotated slightly to the sort of general orientation of the geometry within the scene. So that's just important to bear in mind. Turn on local axis, turn on movement gizmo, and you can see where the top of the page will be for any rotation or movement transforms you might make of the section plane. So and I might just reset all those, and I might just then bring myself back up to a sort of standard section orientation. So quick note about dimensions within the Blender system. What dimensions are valid? So if we come to this scene properties panel here, under the unit section, this will set the units of the Blender scene. So if this is 3 across, it'll be, at the moment, 3 meters, because my length is in meters. I've got the metric system chosen, my length is in meters, and my scale multiplication factor is 1. So I live in a metric universe, so I've only tested TechSec with length meters, and I think probably you'll only get the results that you expect if you keep length to meters. But you can, however, change the length scale. So if I was to say 0.1, everything within this Blender scene is now 10 times smaller than it was before. It doesn't look it to you, but it's actually 10 times smaller. So the dimensions of this brick wall is now 0.5 meter rather than 5 meters. So if I was to come back into my TechSec options here and change my page size, you'll see that even though I'm back on A3, which is where I was before, all my geometry is much smaller in terms of that A3 page, because everything within the scene is much smaller. So if you want to change the dimensions of your geometry within Blender, then always keep the length unit to meters, but you can change this length scale dialog if you so wish. So I think now I will cover some of the options within this TechSec view panel. First one is apply PNG. So we've created kind of a sort of a preview PNG image within the Blender file in our image editor. But we can optionally, within SVG mode, we can apply that to the section plane. So if I do SVG section, then we'll see that we get our PNG image appear within our image editor again, but our plane has gone invisible, except it hasn't really gone invisible. Now I'll just remind you, I covered this very briefly in the last video, but I just will remind you, for this effect to work, we have to be in color texture. For in material, it won't work. We need to be in color texture. But if we're in color texture, you'll see that this plane has gone invisible, except it hasn't really, because that PNG has now been applied to that section plane. So, you know, it's not hugely useful within SVG mode. It becomes more useful in subsequent modes because we're not hiding the original geometry. So this PNG image applied to this plane is hidden by our original geometry. But if you want to move the plane off the geometry, then this might be useful in some respect. I will also talk about this create legend option. Now this depends on some object level settings which I'll cover in a moment, but if we do create legend, we'll see that we get little boxes representing the little hatch patterns associated with different elements of our geometry, with a text description that we specify. So that can just provide a simple legend for your section. And if we have a look at, and we can see that in our original SVG file that's created. We can also use template. So if we select use template, then we have a number of options here, and they're all pretty self-explanatory really. These are text entries, and that will allow us to put in a template over the section. So if I come back into my SVG editor, nope, that's not the right one, sorry. And we can see now we have a template applied over the section with the details that we have put in here. So author name Barry White could be Barry White Jr. Title, size, the size of the sheet is auto generated from the plane options. Scale is auto generated from the plane options, but these other ones are text user entry fields, which you can find here. The exception to that is a supplementary information, which I'll cover again in a moment because that's at object level. So that's create legend and template. There is also this inner lines option. Now what I might do is I'm going to up my DPI, and if I press SVG section, you'll see that this image has got a lot bigger. It's got a lot bigger because my DPI is much higher. Now if I zoom in on a certain part of my PNG image, you might not notice this, but this object here butts up against this object. And the line, the section line on the edge of this object sits right on top on the section line of this object, because the two objects, their edges sit on top of each other. So the lines sit on top of each other. If I turn on inner lines, you'll see that now the line for this object sits within its boundaries, and the line for this object sits within its boundaries. So non-inner lines is kind of a typical way section lines are represented in computer graphics, and inner lines is a typical way that they're represented in hand-drawn graphics, or so I've been told by an architecture friend of mine. So that's just a way of changing slightly the sort of stylistic representation of your section. And this inner lines one, especially if you have different colored lines, can make the section lines associated with specific objects a little bit clearer. This option is a little bit more computationally expensive. Doesn't matter in SVG mode so much because we're non-interactive, but in subsequent modes this does slow things down a little bit. So it's sometimes, if you want this, it's sometimes a good idea to have this off until you've positioned everything you want and then turn it on at the end. So that is more or less the TechSec view panel options for SVG mode. So now I'm going to come into some of the options for the objects themselves. Now what I'm going to do, just to make things all a little bit clearer, is I'm actually going to hide a lot of this geometry. Because if I hide it within the collection here, and if it's hidden in the Blender viewport, then TechSec will ignore it. So I'm just going to keep my brick, and I think I've got some objects here that I don't want as well, and alright, so it's my 2, and I don't really want that one. I do want that one. I don't want that one. I just want my 2 brick walls. The disadvantage of using these 2 brick walls is, you see, my rather lazy texturing on the internal surface of that brick wall. But that is by the by. So with only these 2 elements visible, or in fact this one element, which has a mirror modifier applied. With just this one element selected, I can now do SVG section. Except that my section does not intersect with that geometry. So let's do that again. So I get my 2 brick wall section cuts. So let's have a look at some of the options. So obviously these brick walls, they must have been made cuttable. So default is none, which is like the object being hidden. TechSec won't do anything with it. So select cuttable, and then we've got line thickness. Line thickness is the line of the thickness of the section line, and this is relative to your page size. So what if you've got A3 page, oh pardon me, if you select 0.35, then if you print it out on A3, the SVG file that's generated, that line will be 0.35 millimeters thick. And we have here all the kind of standard, certainly architectural line widths, and I guess it would cover a lot of engineering line widths as well. So I can make that 2 millimeters. We get a 2 millimeter line, 0.1, you get a 0.1 millimeter line. So let's put it 0.3. So we can then have the line color. So I can set that line color to whatever I want. Make that brighter, nice and red, and that covers all the lines within the pattern fill as well. We've got line type, full or dashed. So full, we just got a full line. Dashed, if I have integer numbers here, so 20, 10 for example, space separated, then I will create, and again that's millimeters, I will create a 20 mil line and a 10 mil space. So if I go to, I don't know, 2 and 1, 2 mil line, 1 mil space. And I might go back to full for now. Now then we've got the fill. So we've got full. So we just fill that object with the color, the fill color. Fine. But we can also hatch. So this is hatch on its own. So I had brick selected for this brick wall. So let's just do that again. And we will see we've got our brick hatching. But we can have any other kind of hatching. So we could have soft insulation. And I might stick with that for a moment because I can show some other options. We've got the hatch thickness, so we can change, although the color of the pattern lines is the same as the edge line, the actual thickness of these pattern lines can be changed. So, and this again is in millimeters, so I can change it to 0.1 millimeter from 0.2. I can change it to 0.5 and so on. Hatch scale in percent, so this sets the scale of that overall hatch pattern. So 100% becomes rather large. So 20%, 10%, and again, as you can kind of see, arranging your patterns so that they look the way you want them to look and align with your object the way you want them to align is cumbersome in SVG mode. I'm only doing it now to show you the options. Really, if you want to sort of adjust patterns to fit geometry, then either scaled or free modes would be the modes that you would use. We can also set an X offset. So this will move, again in millimeters, the hatch pattern to the left or right. So we can move it left or right. Y offset moves it up or down. Etc. What else have we got here? We've got, hatch rotation. So if I want to rotate it 90 degrees, I can rotate it 90 degrees. And then I might change my X to align that. But like I say, this is cumbersome doing it this way. But you can, if you've got the time. So that sets rotation, that's in degrees, so that can be 90, 45, yeah, whatever you need. There is another fill option, which is hatch and fill. So now we'll get the hatch and we'll get the fill color as well in glorious Technicolor. So yeah, sort of quite a lot of options there, and we've got, it's all detailed in the user manual. But we've got yeah, various kinds of sawn wood, cross, various types of section patterns that can be used. For certain patterns like cross, we also have hatch proportion. This option, at the moment, the cross is only covering half of the space designated to it, because it's at 50%. If we turn it to 100%, then the cross now fills the entire space that's been allocated to it. So this then gives us you know, what is commonly a rigid insulation hatch pattern. So that is, I think, all the options for the particular object that we've got selected in terms of how it looks. We've also got here the option for legend entry. Now this has to be turned on. If we've used create legend here, this has to be turned on, and we need this object turned on, or this option turned on, and then we can apply or specify a legend text. So if I now say create legend, we'll see that I've got my hatch pattern with a test object text next to it. And the final option is triangulate. In general, that should be kept off, or can be kept off, because again, it's a little bit computationally expensive. But sometimes when you're doing a section cut, the section cut relies on Blender's bisect functionality. And sometimes that bisect operator has a problem with certain geometry, just because of the way the edges and vertices and faces are arranged. You might see sort of faces of your geometry disappear, or the section cut not come out properly. In that case, turning on triangulate for that object can help solve that problem. But unless you get a problem, that can be kept off. So those are the sort of cuttable object properties. I'll just come to the section object. The section object properties, again, we have to select section. Default is none, so we have to select section for it to be a section object. And options here are section override, which means that any object cut by this section, instead of having the line and the coloring from the object, it will pick up the line and coloring from the section, which we then specify here. So that can be good if you've got multiple section planes and the one in the background is just providing some background context. Then you can turn on section override and you know, grey that out and make all that section just a consistent visual look. And we also have description here. Now this, if I turn on use template SVG section, oh, I might move that down a bit so we can see what we're doing. So yes, we've got all the things we've specified here, but we don't have any supplementary information. So this allows us to pick a text which is registered within Blender's text editor. So if I go into the text editor and I create a new file and I call that whatever I want, and I just put in section information, new line, then I can now select that description in here. Section information, new line will then appear in the supplementary information dialog box. So yeah, if you make this too long, this will overrun. There's no automatic line wrapping done by this box. So just make sure that you create a new line here to keep your text within your template box here. So what I will just say, now that I'm talking about the text editor, within the text editor there will be created a TechSec log file if anything goes wrong. So I had a problem with my model a couple of days ago and I was getting some error message come up. So nothing will be written here if everything's fine, but if something goes wrong, if something's not how you expect, it can be worth checking this TechSec log file just to see if it produces any useful debug information for you. So I think sort of more or less that is everything I need to cover for this simplest SVG mode. And in the next video I'm going to cover scaled mode, which is an interactive mode. And yes, hopefully I will see you then. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye now.